could have done it.
Yeah, I could have just said, push the red button. I have friends that are watching. They told me last week I disappeared all the time. They said, well, trying to get that in me, it's kind of hard. And I'm not even pacing like I do when I preach. I've never figured that out. I can teach and stand in one place, but I can't preach and stand in one place. I have to wander back and forth. I've been known to go up and down the aisles, especially if you look like you're asleep.
Maybe you feel like a target when you're preaching.
Okay, so in some churches you are.
Yes.
All right, Genesis 16:13. We're dealing with Hagar. Remember, Sarai made her life so miserable that Hagar just took off. No food, no water, no nothing, and she's pregnant. And then an angel of God comes and speaks to her, tells her she's pregnant, which I'm pretty sure she already knows, tells him what to name the child, and that he's going to actually have a multitude of descendants as well as Isaac, who isn't here yet, but yet he also will become multiple nations actually. And verse 13 says, so she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. How did that happen? I guess I must have touched the bar. The red circle wasn't supposed to be there yet. But there we go. Now there it is. There's Beer Lahai Roi. So we're guessing that Abram was here somewhere because he was leaving Egypt. And this is all what they call the Negev, the desert. Not much water, not much food, that type of thing, the wilderness. And that's where she met him. And Beer Lahai Roi means the God who sees me. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Why, you don't mind questions, right? Okay. Why is it that God bless, how to ask it. Why is it that God blessed certain people? Was it God's thought, or was it something that those people transformed into, or where their mind was at?
No, it had nothing to do with them. It's just God chose them.
Just God picked them?
Just God chose them, yep. And turned them, he could have picked anybody, but he chose them. Abraham, whoever it was, God chose them. For his own purposes. And, things like why God does things are very hard.
What's that?
Why God does things is one of those questions it's almost impossible to answer. Other than God promises he always does what is best and perfect. For that person, for that situation, for the kingdom as a whole, those kinds of things. Let's see. And verse 15 says, and Hagar bore Abram a son. And Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So we know that the promise was given to Abram at 75. Now he's 86. So it's 11 years and still no kid. And he's not getting any younger, and neither is Sarai at this point. And one of the reasons the Bible tells us that is in a few minutes, or in a few verses, we're going to find out that how old Ishmael is when Isaac is born. Ishmael is, I believe, 14 when Isaac is born. But we know that because of the fact that we know that at 86, that is when Ishmael was born, and at 100 is when Isaac is born. So it gives us some idea of the time scale. Now, to understand kind of what Hagar is doing, you need to remember that she's Egyptian. She's an Egyptian, and she loves and serves the Egyptian gods. She knows about Abram's God, but that doesn't mean that she's converted to Abram's God. Like many of these ancient peoples, what they would do is they would add God to their pantheon of gods. That happened very often. They didn't give up their old religion, they just added something new to it. Like when you read about Nebuchadnezzar, after Nebuchadnezzar's on all fours and eating grass for 7 years, and then God restores his mind and restores him to the throne, he praises God as being the greatest God, but he doesn't give up his other gods. He just says, he's the highest God above all. But he doesn't convert to monotheism. That's pretty much a Jewish thing during this time. There's virtually no one that goes into that. There was one Egyptian ruler that tried that, but it basically got him killed because he tried to overturn the whole Egyptian religious system by force. That's pretty hard to do. But other than that, there were no other monotheists. Now, that means she has many gods, and their gods are very capricious. If you look at all of the ancient gods, number one, they're created by men. So guess what? They're just like us. They're immoral, they're impatient, they're vengeful. I mean, they're no different than human beings, except they have unlimited power. And they love to make people miserable for some reason. And that's why you have to constantly appease them. You have to constantly bring the gifts because you're trying to get on their good side. See, the whole point of this ancient worship was manipulation. Get the God to like you because you gave the best gift. Therefore, he might be nice. He might not, but he might. And yet, you kind of wonder, why would people bother serving that kind of a God? But, you see, I mean, it was ingrained into their being from the time they were little to where it was a huge part of their lives. In ancient times, religion was a much bigger part of people's lives than modern time. I mean, it took up a huge portion of their lives and what they look forward to. The festivals, the worshiping, the offerings, the sacrifices, all of that kind of thing. Their lives were completely constrained by their gods. Now, these gods didn't give any moral, ethical laws. They didn't care about that. You know, they slept with each other and lied and cheated and backstabbed and all that kind of stuff. So they were very hard to deal with. And why you had to constantly appease them. Now, one thing I've always found very interesting is all of these false gods had to be cared for by humans, by the priests. What? Somebody have a question? Okay. SCW
You
pointing.
mentioned the other gods. They were not gods.
No, but that's what people thought they were. These are all false. They don't exist. They're just people's imaginations. And that's what I'm getting to, is that they would have these statues or an effigy in a temple, and then the priest's job was to get up in the morning, wash them, bathe them, clothe them, literally put clothes on them, bring food and set it in front of them, which of course they didn't eat because it's a statue. And then when it rots, throw it out, and at night, undress them, put them back in their niche so they can go to sleep. And so what's always amazed me about that is, why would you worship a God who doesn't even have the power to bathe, clothe, and feed himself? What can he possibly do for you? You know, kind of thing. And yet that's exactly what happened. If you wonder what priests did all day, that's a big part of it. It was keeping the temple clean. It was running the temple business, because in most temples were extremely wealthy, and had owned lots of land outside the cities where they could grow crops and animals. And in fact, you'll find a lot of the unrest in ancient cities and empires because the priests rose to too high a position of power equal to the king. And then they would butt heads, which happened in medieval times with the Catholic Pope and the king. You know, in Europe, often the popes had as much or more power than the kings did, of France, of Germany, of England, of different places. So, but you know, you think, why would you want to serve a God like that? Now, this gives you insight into why. I don't know if you've ever wondered why in the temple God had this table that they put 12 loaves of bread on every Sabbath. Every Sabbath, 12 loaves of bread went on there. You're like, what is that for? It's not to feed God. That's not what it's for. This is done in the holy place, the front part of the temple. The Holy of Holies is in the back. That's where God comes down on the Ark of the Covenant. What this was is at the end of 7 days, do you know what happened to the bread? It was given to the priest to eat. So the point was to show that it was consecrated bread and that God was taking care of his people. He's feeding them. The exact opposite of what the false gods have to do. The people have to feed the gods. But with the one true living God, he feeds the people. And that's what the symbolism is he takes care of them. They don't take care of him. What can we do for God? What does God need from us?
Nothing.
Absolutely nothing. Nothing. And he doesn't, I mean, even when they made sacrifices back then, what God would say, it was just a pleasing aroma, that's all. And it's really not so much that he likes the smell of burning bull, you know, even though that actually smells pretty good, you know, like somebody's barbecuing. But yet it was because of the aroma was their obedience, you know, because they would bring the animals, whatever, they needed to bring at each of the different sacrifices. But that was what he was doing. He was showing how he was taking care of the people, not them taking care of him, which is a huge difference between them and the false gods, between God and the false gods. And this is again where things like the history and stuff really kind of makes the Bible come to life when you understand what that was about, and that everything in the temple, number one, was symbolic, and number two, symbolic of Jesus. Of course, what else would the bread represent when we get to Jesus?
Bread of life.
The bread of life. That's right. God's giving bread to his people, and in the New Testament, he's giving the bread of life to his people. So there's tremendous symbolism there and tremendous meaning. That's what was fun about when we built the model of the temple in Sedona, this full-scale temple in Sedona, and we did the tours. We would go in explaining what every part was in the Old Testament. We would come out from the Holy of Holies explaining how every part was fulfilled by Jesus. From the base of the posts that were made out of silver, to the altars, to everything. Every piece of that temple, its purpose was to point to Jesus. And then he fulfilled everything found in the temple. The forgiveness of sins, holiness, righteousness, all that sort of thing. And it was very interesting. One of the most interesting tours I did, though, was I had a guy that came, was just him. We usually tried to wait till there was at least 5, 6, 7 people. But it'd been a while, it was just him, so I took him through. Well, this guy was both a Jew and an Israelite, and there's a difference. A Jew, you are born by genetics. You're born a Jew. You're only an Israelite if you make Aliyah, go back to Israel, become a citizen of Israel, serve in the Israeli military, and then you're an Israelite. And he was both. He lived in California. And he kept asking me, so you're Christians? Yeah. This is a full-scale temple? Yeah. Why? Because he was Jewish. He wanted to know why we were so interested in his temple of his, religion kind of thing. And he was just amazed that Christians would go to that much trouble to do some Jewish Old Testament thing. So I got to take him in and bring him out and explain it all and all that kind of thing. Who knows how much impact it had? He left. I've never seen him since, but you never know. And we had 1,000 people go through that before God brought a summer storm and tore it to pieces on us. And I guess God decided a week was enough because we had a really bad monsoon come through and it weakened it, moved it all so much it wasn't safe to go in anymore. And we had to take it down. And then we sent it on elsewhere. We didn't originally build it. There was a large church in California that had used it for some Old Testament Bible studies. But then they didn't want to just take it down and throw it away. Then they kind of sent out and said, anybody who wants it, come and get it. And so we sent some guys over with trailers to get it and brought it here. And it was very interesting. It was one of those things God did. We actually got a non-Christian in Sedona to let us use the property where the Whole Foods now sits. That used to be level with the road. They dug it all down to put the Whole Foods down in there next to Walgreens. And they let us use it for free and put the temple there and all that stuff on that piece of property. Right there on 89A, So, all right. God does not need humans to do anything for him. And the only thing he wants from us is obedience. That's what he wants from us, and love. Which in God's world, the two are the same thing. Love and obedience. Now, all the sacrifices in the Jewish temple, they were for things like thankfulness, peace, to support the priests, sin offerings, but never an offering to try to get on God's good side. That's never a part of it. None of the rules or commands are in there for that. It's just being obedient. Now, all of this is why Hagar says, you're the God who sees me. Have her false gods ever done anything to prove they actually see, know, and understand her and are going to intervene in her life? No, not ever. This is new territory for her. This God of Abraham and his family is a God who actually does things. He's a living, breathing God, not like the ones they worship. My favorite on that is, I think it's in the book of Jeremiah, I can't remember, but he's got a whole passage there that makes fun of going out in the woods, chopping down a tree. The woodsman goes out in the woods. He cuts down a tree. He cuts it in half. Half he makes a god out of, and half he puts in the fireplace. And he's going, how does that make any sense? You're the man, you made it, and out of the same wood, you burned it for heat that you made this supposed god. And it even goes on to make fun of, if you don't nail the god down, they fall over. So you have to nail the bottom down. And things like that. So, all right. It impresses her to such an extent that she gives God a new name. And that name, Bir Lahai Roi, means the well of the living one who sees me, is what it actually means. Now, for us, it's not a big deal. We're used to, as Christians on this side of Christ's death, of God being actively involved and alive and involved in our lives and every day. That's common to us. But in their world, it was not. It was extremely uncommon and unusual.
That bread looks good.
I'm wondering how good it was after 7 days sitting out on the table.
Right out of the oven is the best time.
Maybe a little dry by then. So, let's see. And also, not only did God see her, but God sent a supernatural being to talk to her and to tell her what he wanted. Because he tells her, go back, submit to Hagar, and I'll take care of you, and your son's going to be born healthy. He's going to live a long time. He's going to have innumerable descendants, all those kinds of things. So, all right, chapter 17, verse 1. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram. So now we're 13 years into the future from when Ishmael was born, because he's 99. The Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. So this is 13 years later. So now it's been 24 years since the promise was given that he would have a son through Sarai, at this time still. And yet, he's 99, no kid. And Sarai's 89, and no kid. So, now, what God does is he's going to reissue the covenant. And the reason for this is things have changed. How many sons was he going to have before Hagar? One. Isaac. How many nations was he going to be the father of? One. Okay? Now he's going to be the father of a multitude of nations because of Ishmael and his descendants. So now God's going to reiterate it and include that. And he's even going to change Abram's name to Abraham, signifying that he's the father of a multitude of nations, not just of one. So now what he tells him to do is he says, walk before me and be blameless. Blameless in the Bible does not mean perfect nor sinless. You will find several times where people are called blameless. Blameless is in reference to the outward accomplishing of your beliefs, like doing the sacrifices and the offerings and all the things that the Jews were supposed to do. Another person that was something similar to that is what we find in the New Testament. If we live by the Spirit, let us also keep in step with the Spirit. That would be blameless. Can we be perfect while walking this earth? No. Can we never sin again? No. We wish we wouldn't. But we can do everything in our power to keep in step with the Spirit. And if we do that, God calls us blameless because we're giving it everything we've got in order to follow his will. There's another person in the Bible. What do I have here? Job 1. I'm trying to see what I've got there. Yes, under this idea of blameless, Job 1:1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. This kind of gives you the definition of blameless. Feared God, turned away from evil. And if you look at Job's life, at his arguments, for the next 38 chapters of the book of Job, his argument is basically, Lord, I've lived a blameless life. Why are you letting this happen to me? Kind of thing. And we've done that, as I'm sure, because you've run into problems in your life as a Christian. You go to God and say, God, I've always tried to do what you want. Why is this happening to me? Right. Type of thing. And that's where faith comes in, that God does what's best and perfect, because it doesn't always seem like it. In fact, very often it doesn't seem like it. But all this is saying is, and if you go on and read about Job, what does it say? It says that he was a man who, did his best to keep what he knew about God, the rules and the laws and the commands. Now remember, this is before the written law. This Job is considered one of the oldest books in the Bible. It's one of the oldest time periods. And yet Job knew how to worship God and we've seen from the very beginning, Adam and Eve knew how that information got passed down orally, maybe was written down. In fact, very likely it was written down, pre-flood, that type of thing. And so Job, if you remember, Job would even go and do sacrifices for his kids after they had a wild night of partying in case they sinned. That's how far he went. And then when you watch his arguments, as he goes on with his complaining, he lists out all the good that he'd done. I was a counselor. I took care of the weak and the poor. I cared for he goes all through all that kind of stuff. And so he was blameless, but he wasn't perfect. Because we won't be that until we get our new bodies and get out of this world. But what you do find is Job was blameless in his ability to carry out the outward aspects of religion, but he didn't really know God. God was a distant character that you did things. And then in the end of the book, what you find, this great turnaround, is Job says, I thought I knew God, but now I have seen him. Meaning he's had a personal, and he understands who God is now. That's the whole point of the book, in actuality. The main point is that idea. So, now, blameless is a measure of how well we live before God, how well we keep in step with the Spirit. Now, God's commanding Abram to continue to do this, to continue to fear him, to be upright, do what is right, turn away from evil, because he's going to reiterate this great covenant with him. Only it's slightly different now. As I said, the covenant now is not just one nation, but a multitude of nations. So he literally is going to have descendants that you can't number, not just the Jews. Now, the only ones still existing are the Jews. But he did have other nations that came from him. So let's see. Before he was to be the father of a nation, now a multitude of nations. So what are these nations? Now, the first one is, of course, the Israelites. But to Ishmael, it's the Arabs, what we call the Arab peoples today, what were the Bedouin Arabs and now are the Arabs of Saudi Arabia. The Midianites, they came from Keturah. Remember, Sarah dies, Abram marries Keturah, and then Keturah, she's his third wife. She has children, and she has the Midianites. Then Esau, the brother of Jacob, you just can't trust some people.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I started
Let
getting
me see which way we're going
He was
here.
very excited with all this knowledge.
No, it was upside down. It was the other way around. The red
Was it?
dot was on this side.
I tried it both ways, trying to see how it looked. I'll have to put on when I put it upside.
That's pretty good.
There's going to be a little wild craziness going on.
Sorry about that.
I'm trying to figure out a better place to put it, and I haven't figured it out yet.
That was a commercial break.
Yeah. Has this ever happened in your life? You need to know God as it goes tumbling all over. All right, the Kenizzites, they came from Esau. The Amalekites came from Esau. And the Edomites came from Esau. So, let's see if I got them all. Right. And then we're going to change from Abram to Abraham. Abram, exalted father, because he's going to be the father of Israel. But now, he's Abraham, father of many nations. The Israelites, Arabs, Midianites, Canaanites, Amalekites, and Edomites. Now, the Edomites, their genetics are still part of the people of Jordan, because that's where they were. And some of the other nations. But as a people, what the original Edomites were, that's gone. They've intermarried with all these different peoples. But if we knew the genetics of Esau, we could track them down, because they would have his genetics in them to some extent. But most of them, all of them but Israel, well, and the Arabs are still here, but they're not exactly the original Arabs. Again, there's a lot of intermarrying in there as well. And as I told you before, anymore, the Palestinians are Arabs, the Egyptians are Arabs, the Arabs spread all over when they had the great Arab caliphates. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. Okay, chapter 17, verse 6. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. Not king, kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant. What kind of covenant? Everlasting. And it's a covenant that's one-sided. Israel doesn't have to do some particular thing for the covenant to remain true. Remember, a covenant is a promise made by a superior that's in perpetuity. So there's nothing they need to do. Doesn't mean they'll always be on the right side of God, because most of their time they're not. They're in trouble. But yet God says that he's going to make an everlasting covenant. So that covenant lasts until the great white throne judgment, which is the end of all of this. And we all go to live in the kingdom of heaven. But it'll last until then. Let's see. To be God to you and to your offspring after you. That's the covenant. And here's the other part of it. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So he'll be their God, but he'll also give them the land. And he does that. Now they never fully obey him, so they never get fully the land. And for a long time they're out of the land. But it's never not theirs. Even when they're not the rulers of the land of Israel, it's still their land. And it's still their land to this day. Because that's the covenant God made. So the covenant to inherit the land of Canaan was only to Israel. None of the other children from Esau, Ishmael, God doesn't tell them they're going to inherit any particular land. He says they're going to have lots of descendants. And they do end up with land and end up with kings and things of that nature. But God never promises that. And it's, of course, he doesn't promise it, and it's not everlasting. Only Israel. And again, we see that true today. The Edomites had a land, the Midianites, the Amalekites, all of them had a land that they ruled. They've all been defeated and destroyed and intermarried and disappeared, except Israel. Still has the land of Canaan, and it's still filled with Jewish people who are genetically Jewish. Trace it all the way back. Who know which tribe they came from, who know which son they came from. That type of thing. And this is to be an everlasting covenant, one-sided, just a promise God made. God watches over them, protects them, but he also punishes them, but he keeps them alive. I mean, he allows them to be killed, like Nazi Germany. Like, most people don't even know that the Soviets killed as many as the Germans did in the Soviet Union. They killed millions of Jews as well. So they've had to suffer, but that's because of their disobedience. And to this day, they haven't returned to God. The people, the bulk of the Jews living in the land of Israel are very secular. They have no God. And same with most of American Jews are quite secular as well. But eventually they are going to come back to God. But God is still there, keeping an eye on them. And as we looked before, any nation that's aggressed against Israel, what happens to them? Yep, God says, those who bless Abraham and his descendants, I bless. Those who curse him, I curse. Those who despoil him, I despoil. Those who plunder him, I plunder. So God will let it happen to punish Israel, but then he goes and destroys the nation that did it. And that's what we see. Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Romans, it doesn't matter. Nazi Germany killed the Jews. What happened to Nazi Germany? Soviet Union killed the Jews. What happened to the Soviet Union? It's also gone. And people think it's because of political reasons and economic reasons. It's because of how they treated the Jewish people. That's what brought all that about. Now, God may have done it through economics and other things, but that's not the reason. That's just the method that he used. And why is it, America, we looked at this before, why are we the greatest nation that ever lived? Primarily because we've been the best ally Israel's ever had. That's why. And as we turn against Israel, watch what happens to our nation. It's already happening to us. Let's see, where am I? Yep. Okay. Did I cover that? Notice that in this single passage, God uses the term everlasting twice. It's everlasting that they'll have innumerable descendants, everlasting that they'll inherit the land of Canaan, that the Jews will inherit the land of Canaan. But always, when God repeats the same thing in one verse, in one passage, or close passages, that means it's very important, and to pay close attention to it. Now, there have been many times throughout their history where the Jews don't have control. In fact, they were out of control longer than they had control, to be quite honest, during their time, because they wouldn't do what God told them to do. But even when they weren't in control of the land, under the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and on, there were still a lot of Jews in the land. So, like under the Babylonians, it got down pretty small because so many were deported, but yet they were still there and still in the land. And we can look at some of this. Israel lost their land. First, well, the northern kingdom of Israel, remember, they were obliterated by the Assyrians, and the bulk of those 10 tribes disappeared, no longer to be Jewish. And all that was left was the southern kingdom, which was Judah, and the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. They called it Judah because it was by far the biggest. Benjamin was a very small part of that. And then the Judah was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. That's when he destroys the kingdom, destroys all of their fortified cities. Then he takes Jerusalem and he levels Jerusalem. And then he deports Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, the kings, and all that kind of thing that he does. So, trying to think, okay. And that is from that point until 1948, Israel is never in control of the land again. In 168 AD, the Maccabee family got control of Jerusalem and some of the surrounding area from the Romans, but that didn't last very long. It lasted, like, I'm trying to remember now, about 10 years or so. And then the Romans came in and wiped them out and took it. I think actually they took it from the Antiochus Epiphanes and that group of people that were the Seleucids. Yeah, were in charge of it until the Romans took it. And so they're out of the land. They were out for, and then in 1948, the Israelis gained their independence and control of their nation. So after World War II, against all odds, there was no political way or reason that Israel would be given back the land of Israel. And yet they were. In 1948, they're given back the land and put in control of it. Because there's also prophecies in the Old Testament where God says, I'm going to vomit you out of the land because you aren't obedient. But then he also says, with most of those prophecies, he also flips around and says, but there is a time coming when I will bring you back to the land, and eventually you'll become this world-renowned, great, powerful kingdom. That doesn't happen until the 1,000-year reign of Christ. But he did say he would bring them back to the land, and that's exactly what he did.
Yeah, so you don't mind questions, right? Okay, so it just made me flash on like being obedient and not obedient. I mean, you know, it's like I'm definitely not even close to being totally obedient. But what I'm saying is like, what about what's happening to America now? It's like it's just really falling apart, it's getting really crazy, right?
Right.
So is that because God is just doing that and evil's taken over, or is it because we've been disobedient to God?
You mean as Christians?
Yes.
It's not because we've been disobedient to God. God only does that in our individual lives, or maybe the life of a church, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I don't feel that, but I'm
Yes,
just.
but no, he's, because this country was never promised to us or any, there's no connection like that. It's simply the way of people and nations is really what's happening.
Right.
Nations, here's what happens. You give man leisure time, and every time he invents evil. It's that simple. The old adage that the idle hands are the devil's workshop has enormous truth in it. Because if you look through time, when we're having to struggle to live, just to get enough food to eat, and so on and so forth, we don't have time for all this other evil. But as soon as you've got an empire, where you've got a large economy, and then people now suddenly have leisure time, the upper people, lower people don't, but the upper class people do, man's mind always goes to evil,
Like
100% of the time.
There are many people on the phone 24 hours.
Oh, yeah, but I mean, it's just, in America, and today's world, the only difference is we can do it a lot faster. We can become immoral and so on a lot faster because we have the ability, because of the internet and other things. We can spread evil a lot faster, that kind of thing. That's why it cracks me up that outside of Christianity, every other religion, philosophy, every other worldview and belief believes the heart of man is basically good. But you can't find any examples of that anywhere in history. There are times when people can do good things. But overall, name me a time in history where humanity is doing good. There isn't one. We're always at war. We're always killing each other. We're always enslaving each other. I mean, when did we start killing each other? Cain and Abel. All the way back to the very beginning when they're the only two siblings around, and yet they kill each other. For some stupid reason of taking the wrong kind of sacrifice, and God liking him better than he likes me, so I'll just kill him. That type of thing.
It's happening all over the place.
Oh yeah, we're still doing it all over the
Judging
place.
one another,
Yep.
criticizing.
That's the nature of man. That's the problem.
It's horrible.
So Israel was actually out of control of the land under occupation for 2,534 years. And then, miraculously, as God had described, they got the land back. And it's miraculous in a multitude of ways. Do you remember what happened the minute, and I mean the minute, they were given independence in the land? The very next morning, as a matter of fact. What happened? 30,000 well-equipped and trained Arab soldiers attacked Israel. They launched a surprise attack, and Israel, did they have a military?
No.
No, they'd just been given the country back. That's it. They had a 15,000-man militia that had been fighting against some of the Palestinians that were already causing trouble. Because the minute they started talking about dividing the land and giving Israel part and the Palestinians part, they started killing the Jews, and then they started fighting back. Now they had no tanks, no planes, no artillery, no heavy equipment. And you know what? The United States put an embargo against them for any weaponry. We would not sell them weaponry. And we didn't want anybody else. We wouldn't sell weaponry to anybody. The issue with that is the Arab armies already had all they needed. Tanks, planes, artillery. They were huge, well-equipped armies. And there were 30,000 of them. And they were from, I'm trying to remember where they were from the Arabs, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Every country around Israel attacked them en masse as soon as they became a nation. Now, Israel did have available to it, besides the 15,000 trained soldiers, they had 30,000 civilians, farmers and whatnot that they could hand guns to who've never been in a war in their life, to go out and fight. Now, one thing God did to enable them, they won this fight against all odds. And I saw an interview with some of the older Jews that were alive during this time. They said, you came from somewhere else to Israel because now you're going to have your own land. You got off the bus, they handed you a gun and some ammo and said, go. And you did.
You want it, you're...
If you wanted to keep the land.
There was a program years ago called Against All Odds, and it showed a part where their weapons wouldn't work. They were trying to fire them, and they would not work.
The Arabs, you mean?
Yes. Against it, and I've heard stories of these older Jewish Israelis talking about these things that were happening that nobody could explain.
Yeah, well, no one can explain how that group could push out that military with air support and all that they had, to attack them with. Part of what God did was, because it was all different countries, they didn't coordinate what they were doing. They attacked from all different directions, but they attacked one at a time. So Israel could move their troops. If they were doing it right, they'd have all attacked at once, and then Israel would have been spread so thin they couldn't do anything. But they didn't. And again, that's God. God controls the hearts and minds of these people. So not only did they defeat the Arabs, they pushed them back and gained more land, but then had to give it back. The UN made them give it back, even though they were the ones attacked. They didn't attack anybody. They won the war, and anybody else that did that, they'd get to keep the land. But the UN forced them to give it all back, pretty much, to the Palestinians. When the Palestinians, who are Arabs, remember that, there's no such thing as an ethnic Palestinian. That's an Arab that lives in Palestine, what the Romans called Israel. You know how they talk about how this is our land, our homes, we were forced out by the Jews? That's nonsense. The Egypt and the Saudi Arabians and all that, they came to them and said, get out of your homes, go to these camps we've created, because we're going to come through there and we're going to annihilate the Jews, and then you can move back, but it's going to be an active war zone. Well, Israel won. And did you know that there are still those Palestinian Arabs, many of them still living in Jordan, in refugee camps? all the way from 1948, because their own people won't give them anything back. And so Israel had nothing to do with it. It was the Arabs that told them to get out. And then Israel took the land, and then Israel had to give the land back. So they got their homes back, but Israel didn't give it all back, the whole nation, you know. Besides that, when they say, well, our families have been here for hundreds of years, the Jews have been there for thousands of years. So there's nothing to that claim. And Israel was happy to live with Arabs in their country, living in homes, as long as they weren't out killing Jews, you know, but they didn't. So that's kind of what happened there. And I went and looked up exactly, the only people who would sell weapons to Israel was Czechoslovakia. They had a bunch of weapons left over from World War II, because this isn't long after, and they were able to sell them to them. And what they mainly had were bolt-action rifles, a small number of machine guns, bayonets, a few heavy machine guns, and pistols, like 900 heavy machine guns. You're fighting an army of 30,000 with tanks and all of that, and you get 900 machine guns, heavy machine guns. Some machine guns, some automatic rifles, and then light machine guns. But that's it. They didn't get any kind of heavy equipment. It's kind of similar to the Russians attacking the Ukraine, who doesn't have an air force, you know, and so on. It didn't have much in the way of heavy weapons until we started sending them over, and that's when they were started pushing the Russians back. So it's kind of similar to that, except in a matter of days, the Jews, with a much smaller, less trained military, defeated a much larger, well-equipped military than what's going on in Russia and the Ukraine, simply because God was the one behind it. In a matter of days, they defeated them, pushed them out, and took the land. And then later on, we have the 6 Day War. Again, same thing. Surprise attack, but Israel still defeats them and pushes them back. And during that one, I think it was the 6 Day War, Moshe Dayan actually freed the Temple Mount. And then the UN and the US and others brought pressure on him and made him take it back. And he did. Or they'd still have the Temple Mount to this day. Let's see. Because there's no way that Israeli military should have been able to defeat the much superior forces of the Arabs. And so God said they'd get their land back, and he said that at his timing it would happen, and that's exactly what happened. They got the land back in 48. And also the Old Testament prophesies they'll never be forced out again. No matter what you hear on the news or see people say or whatever, the Arabs are not pushing the Jews out of Israel. It's not going to happen. They'll be there till the end. And when we get towards the end, the Bible tells us, Paul tells us, all Israel will be saved. The whole nation converts to Christianity during the last days, during the tribulation period type of thing. And then they're all swept out to some place where God protects them and the Antichrist can't get to them. Which eventually I hope to teach the book of Revelation. When you get to that part, you're like, I want to know how that actually worked out. What is it, like put a force field, around them or whatever, but whatever it is, he can't shoot missiles at them, he can't bomb them, he cannot touch them. He can't get to them. And they're told not to take any clothing, food, nothing, because God says he'll provide. So he takes them somewhere in the wilderness, he provides all their food and water, just like the Jews walking for 40 years, until the actual end, when Jesus returns and starts his 1,000-year reign. And then those Jews are the ones that move into it and are the premier nation of the world. Where Jesus actually has his physical throne in the temple, and you can go to Jerusalem and see him sitting there, which would be pretty astounding. Hopefully, we'll be raptured. The way it's looking right now, I'm not so sure anymore, because we're seeing an awful lot of signs of the last days. But I'm still a rapturist, a pre-tribulationist. But it's amazing how much of what we're seeing fits exactly with what the Bible says. The book of Revelation and Daniel and others, happening all around us. So, all right, we'll end there. We'll pick up with 17 verse 9 in the next week. So, let me remember to stop it this time.